thank you very much for everyone who has joined. We'll take you through 3 actions for hybrid cloud success today. And really the aim of this is to have a conversation around the challenges and difficulties and some of the recipes, if you will, in order to help make hybrid or multi-cloud deployments a success. With that, without further ado, let me go into the actual slide. And of course, there we go. Slight technical difficulties. So just going through the agenda, we obviously will do a very quick introduction of Simon and myself. We'll talk a little bit about hybrid cloud in numbers in terms of trends, some of the research that we're seeing, some of the points customers have made, and we'll have a look at the complexities of distributed environments. So things that I've touched on earlier on in terms of what are the pitfalls, the challenges, and how to solve these. And then we start going into the pillars of hybrid cloud success, right? So the things that you have to do, you must do in order to be successful in your hybrid cloud deployment. And at the very end, we'll obviously have time for Q&A. So with that in mind, if you do have questions, please post them. We will try not to answer them throughout the session, just to make sure that, and really that's for me not to go off on a tangent, but we'll try to obviously answer these towards the end of the session in the Q&A time. Right, a little bit about ourselves. Simon, please give us the honor and talk a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name's Simon Armet. I'm a pre-sale systems engineer for Runecast. I've been with the company now for about 8 months, so I'm here to support you guys with any opportunities and any requirements that you have moving forward. Previous life has included Microsoft and Commvault and Veritas, so have had some exposure to the cloud platforms as they are. But yeah, just here to support you guys moving forward.
Thank you, Simon. Now to the task that everyone hates the most, talking about themselves. So a little bit about me. My name is Markus Strauss. I'm still one of the newer members in Runecast. I joined in early January. I'm leading the product management teams, and in my previous life, I've worked for SolarWinds in product, McAfee, Symantec, Trend Micro. You see a slight common theme here. And yeah, really happy to be here, and I'm really looking forward to work together with the team on building great solutions for the rest of the year and beyond, obviously, right? So with that, let's start going into the actual slides. So when we start looking at multi-hybrid cloud environments in numbers, we could virtually spend days looking at statistics and research. But a few things that are really interesting are the adoption rates in the hybrid cloud environment space, right? So when we start looking at multi-clouds, for example, and the averages that are currently in use, it seems to be much larger than a lot of people do think or expect. So when we look at the averages right now, we're talking somewhere in the 7.5 different clouds neighborhood, and by 2023, the average is supposed to be going up around 10.5, right? And even industries like healthcare providers, which are generally, historically speaking, behind the technology curve, are really ramping up in that space as well. Now, all of these kind of neatly fit into their categories, if you will, within the research space. So you've got your hybrid cloud environment and you've got your public cloud environment your multi-cloud environment. Now, we will see pretty soon that that does not necessarily always reflect reality. And again, I am very certain that's not news to anyone. But I think the main point is, no matter which way the organization looks, we cannot move away from the fact that deployments across multiple clouds, whether that's a hybrid cloud or multi-cloud or a combination thereof, is not something we're able to get away from, if you will, right? These are in existence and are just about to grow even further. Now, one interesting thing is part of the research, and part of the research that a lot of companies do is looking at what are the main drivers for organizations to consider moving into a hybrid cloud or multi-cloud environment. Right? And the interesting bit or tidbit here is when we start looking at the curve of drivers, when we get to 2021, we can see clearly the availability aspect has overtaken the let's call it the new and shiny and hip software use case that in a lot of cases a lot of organizations have picked as one of the main drivers. So that's your AI, ML, DevOps, AI ops scenario, right? But as the multi and hybrid cloud deployments mature, the availability aspect becomes a much bigger topic. Really, it's to guarantee availability. Now, we've talked a little bit about the private and the public cloud aspect. So let's try and map these key drivers against the different types of clouds, right? So if we start looking at private cloud deployments, for certain, availability is one aspect. New and different application services, yes, maybe. It depends. It gets very expensive very quickly. And a lot of organizations find that with private cloud deployments, when you start doing especially AI ML, it can get very expensive very fast. Now we try to do the same thing on the public cloud, and obviously same thing. Availability, definitely one of the key drivers to use public cloud deployments. Leveraging new application services, definitely a driver to use public cloud deployments, especially because a lot of the cloud service providers will provide their own built-in big data, AI, ML, data stores and data lakes and things like that. But also to minimize cost, right? Cost to serve is a big aspect. The interesting part about cost to serve, especially in the medium term and long term, is really around the initial savings versus the long-term cost. We've found, and a lot of customers and industry veterans that we've talked to all said the same. In the longer term, if organizations are not careful with their cloud environments, it can become much more expensive than it would have been on-prem. And we'll touch on this a little bit later on as well. But these are the key drivers. Now, if you cast yourself back one slide when we talked about the neatly packed clouds in terms of hybrid and multi-clouds, that looks fantastic in statistics and things like that, and obviously nice slide decks. But reality looks much different, right? This is much more what reality looks like. In most organizations, it's not an either or. It's not a 0 and 1. It's usually a combination of all of the different cloud deployments that's being in reality found within most companies. Now we do have a poll, so let me pull that poll up, because I would like to see, at least at the end, we can touch on this, what your belief is around your own multi-cloud strategy. And the reason why I'm asking this is because I'm going to make a pretty bold statement in the next slide, right? And we will see whether that actually tracks with the response. Whether you have a cloud strategy or not, you have one. Full stop. Your teams will and have deployed cross-cloud. Whether you have, as an organization, set that strategy already or not, by and large, does not make any difference on how teams operate. We want teams to be self-sufficient, self-driving, especially when we start going into cloud native applications, when we start going into new technology development. We want teams to be self-sufficient, and we give teams all of the tools they need to do a fantastic job in creating new software, new product, or new offerings, or maintaining existing cloud native or even on-prem architectures. But what that brings is teams will inevitably start containerizing, start deploying in private clouds and public clouds, cross clouds, without necessarily the organization having a fix or set strategy. So when we start talking about the complexities of multi and hyper cloud deployments, when we start peeling that a little bit down to the various different areas and challenges most organizations have, hybrid is obviously, that's in the word, right? We talked about this already, but we can start looking at this hybrid in a sense, not only physically hybrid, so we're talking AWS, Azure, Kubernetes, GCP, any of the providers, or VMware, Hyper-V, Nutanix, but also in terms of hybrid with different teams, different locations, different geolocations. Disparate. Nothing really is directly connected anymore. Everything is highly distributed. Everything has disparate environments and different teams and different places to look, and that becomes really, really challenging to have a good grasp on what's actually going on in the deployments. And I'm sure when we look at some environments, like Simon, I'm sure you've come across environments that have all of the hallmarks of fitting into these categories, right?
Absolutely. And reporting against those based, if, for example, on compliance or security, is an unenviable task for many organizations, because typically there'll be separate product sets that report against these different architectures. And being able to consolidate that with a single view is an arduous task. And quite often, you can be in a position where, well, there's cost associated with that as well, in terms of staff training and different product sets in order to be able to do that. But you can often find that there'll be gaps as well. So you're going to miss out on certain areas of compliance that you're not compliant on because of the gaps. So multiple platform types and disparate products out there introduce their own form of complexity, which has a cost and a risk associated with it. And we see that all the time with many of our customers.
Absolutely, yeah. And it also tends to be inefficient, right? So the inefficiency of having to manage multiple complex workflows across multiple complex teams across, and you see where I'm going, right? I could spin this further into multiple complex environments, all adds up in terms of time it takes to either discover a problem, a vulnerability, a compliance breach, or a compliance gap, and the time it takes to remediate that, right? Mean time to resolution is something that's, I think, a common term that's something that's known to everyone on this call, but it really translates into a higher exposure of risk potentially, right? Being ill-prepared in terms of not having the right processes in place, not because the organization doesn't want to have the right processes in place, but just because it's simply impossible. And the time it takes to remediate the issue, which again is a costly affair, because every man hour costs money, and that's unfortunately the way it works. But also, every hour it takes longer to remediate a problem, depending on the gravity of the problem, can potentially exponentially increase the risk to the organization. Right. So let's start having a look at the three pillars, the three areas, the three key points of success when you look at hypercloud, multi-cloud deployments. Really, it's down to visibility, unification, and preparedness, right? The reason why these three are so important is it's quite simple. Visibility is that's your building block. That's the foundation of what every organization needs to be able to achieve, is the visibility. Unification, well, we just touched on this a little bit in terms of the challenges around multiple teams and multiple solutions. Unification is really, really powerful for the organization to ensure that you have a very good handle on the processes, the risk, the exposure, and then lastly, preparedness. And it's one of those blanket statements. I think everyone understands and agrees that everyone needs to be prepared, but it's easier said than done if your entire setup is very much reactive, right? As long as you're in a reactive mode, you're never really truly prepared. You're firefighting, and I think we've all been there. So, those three are really kind of the cornerstones of ensuring that your organization not only has success with multi or hybrid clouds, but it can thrive and it can grow to the extent it needs to. You can't manage and optimize what you can't see, right? I mean, it's a very bland, clear, straightforward statement, but it holds true, right? You can manage or protect what you can't see. It's incredibly important to be able to have this visibility. So let's pick our standard private public cloud deployment here, right? Well, you generally have a pretty good idea of or one would hope everyone has a pretty good idea, excuse me, of what's in the environment, right? You've got database sources, you've got VMs, you've got server, you've got serverless workloads, you've got containerized workloads, you name it, right? But then there is an aspect of I have no idea. And the I have no idea aspect is the one that's the most critically important, because at the end of the day, everything else that you know and that you see, you can put policies in place and rules in place to ensure that everything is on the right software version, everything is configured the way it needs to be, everything is protected the way it should be, whether that's AV, similar things, edge or web application firewalls, you name it, right? The problem is, or the problem are, the assets that you don't know. So what do you have to do? Regardless of location, private or public cloud, you must know all of your assets across all environments. If you do not, you always have a blind spot. And that blind spot is potentially the blind spot that ends up causing either performance problems, causing monetary issues, right? So we talked about this earlier on briefly, where we said, long term, if one isn't careful, cloud deployments or public cloud deployments, or any cloud deployments really, can become cost efficient depending on what way things are deployed and how many assets are there, right? Regardless of technology used, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's containerized, whether it's VMs, whether it's standard server deployments. No matter where it is, geographical location these days is no longer really an aspect that organizations should have to worry about, because we're all very dispersed in terms of how we work. I mean, I think Runecast itself is a pretty good example of this. We are based all around the globe, so are most other companies these days, and we have assets all over the globe. And what type of asset it is, right? So whether that is a database, whether that's a file server, whether that's a VM, whether that's a Kubernetes container, it should and must not matter, because as an organization, in order to really understand your deployment, you have to understand where your assets are, what assets you have, and with that, make informed decisions on what you need to do in order to enforce policies, be compliant, make sure your spend is under control. It's a very important point as well. And all of this only really is effective once you have an idea of what's actually in the environment.
We met with many of our clients as well, that we often find that assets are quite dynamic as well. Assets come and go, and they shift. And the whole purpose of cloud is that elasticity. So being able to, it's not a static thing anymore. It's an ever-moving target. So that adds additional complexity into the environments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the live and destroy cycles, or create and destroy cycles within public cloud, and especially when we start going to containerized solutions and things like that, are incredibly short-lived, right? So VMs or containers get spun up for a particular task, fulfill that task, and within hours, minutes, days, depending, that asset is gone again because it has fulfilled its task, right? Now, we take this one step further and start talking about the unification aspect. Let's again stick with our hypothetical scenario and environment here. Generally, when we start looking at what type of environments we see in the industry, most of these are organically homegrown environments that started out with an on-prem data center, maybe a private cloud, maybe adding some public cloud deployments, and it organically grows. With that organic growth, generally also comes the organic growth of different solutions. So every color and arrow here represents effectively a different solution set that's in use in your organization somewhere, right? Whether that is for monitoring specifics in your AWS environment, whether that is to ensure compliance for your Kubernetes environment, whether that's ensuring you can troubleshoot your VMware environment, the likelihood of an organization having organically grown and added multiple solutions to cover the entirety of the environment is very high. Most of us have seen this, most of us have lived this in one way or another. But the problem is none of these in the long run are as effective individually as a unified approach to this would be, right? So going back to the efficiencies that we talked about earlier on, currently when you look at this, and in a lot of cases that is a pretty standard cross-section of what an organization looks like, you are serving different solutions in order to solve different problem sets, right? So each one of these requires obviously a time investment in training. There's a monetary investment, obviously, for the purchase and things like that, but we're not going to go into that. But it requires a time investment for training. These solutions may or may not talk to each other. If they do, that's great. You can make use of that. But even there, you're generally limited in terms of what you can actually get in terms of cross-communication. Each of these potentially serves just one particular team with one particular use case. And none of this is really truly connected to each other. And the problem with these things is quite obvious in terms of it's very difficult to manage, it's very difficult to scale, it's very difficult to train, and it's very easy for, if we play the security angle for a minute, it's very easy for someone to circumvent some of these individually, right? Because as solutions do not communicate with each other, and the organization has several blind spots because of that, you'll see that the ability for an aggressor of sorts is going to be a lot higher to circumvent one of these rather than all of them as a unified situation, right? So if we kind of map this to what it should look like, what you have to look for, it's looking something like this, right? Because first of all, you do want to make sure that you have a way to unify all of your security, compliance, IT infrastructure monitoring across all of your multiple clouds. Because of all of the things we touched on earlier on, but also because it means your organization now has moved away from a multi-product, multi-solution environment to really starting to serve your internal stakeholders, your teams, the people that end up having to work on these environments. You're moving away from creating silos for specific problems to really creating teams or creating the right tool sets for teams rather than siloed solutions, right? It's incredibly important to understand the power of having all of these things connected, talking to each other through one platform, through one unified way. And I'm really trying hard to not use the term pane of glass because I think it's been overused a lot. But the point being is it really helps bring the organization together, right? And it's really something that is incredibly important to keep in the back of your mind as you build up and build out your hybrid cloud strategy. So we're starting slowly but surely coming towards the end of the slides, but I think we're going to save the best for last, and that's preparedness, right? The first two are really very much in terms of reactive. These are things that are the cornerstones of your hybrid cloud strategy, right? No matter what way you look at, no matter what the problem set is, no matter what it is you need to achieve internally within the organization, you need to have visibility and you need to have a unified approach on how to look at that from a higher level, right? The third and last one really is what takes this to something that can become part of your strategy, and that's the preparedness, right? Being prepared means for all of your different areas, you have the ability to proactively engage the biggest problem sets that you have, right? So we're looking at, for example, in the security aspect, that's your vulnerability management, right? So you have to be able to cross-platform, cross-environment, cross-geo to do your vulnerability management. You have to be able to see where within your environment you have either services, you have either containers, or you have software within your hybrid deployment that currently or is potentially be at risk of being exploited because of an existing vulnerability. And again, I can't stress enough how important it is to do this across your entire estate, right? It's quite frankly no good to you if you only do it with things that are easy to do and you leave out the things that you have difficulties finding or difficulties seeing, right? It goes back to the point from the very, very beginning in terms of visibility. If you do not know what's there, you cannot manage this, right? Simon is going to tell us a little bit about troubleshooting. how this works across larger estates.
Yeah, so essentially, if you know, we can, if you look into syslogs, if you can report and find that needle in the haystack because you've got this overall view against everything that's going on in your environment, that's a very, very powerful, quick time to resolution capability that you have. And unification essentially gives you that because you're only looking in one place to resolve the issues that you have. Not only from a sort of a reactive point of view, but more so a proactive point of view as well. So being able to marry up any vulnerabilities or any problems in your environment with the relevant information in order to be able to fix that. You can only achieve that with a single product set in effect, rather than multiple product sets, which add complexity.
Yeah, I would assume it's really, well, I know I've seen this in the past, but it's very difficult to, I think, marry 2, 3, 4 different let's say log sets across different architectures that aren't in the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's probably everyone's nightmare, having to troubleshoot something like this, right? If you have to. Compliance obviously is another big aspect of being prepared, meaning your auditor is likely not really going to care all that much whether you have the ability to do the exact same policies across different types of deployments or not. However, you and your organization does care a lot about that, right? The ability to really have your compliance standards or your security standards and policies across your entire estate living and being the same policy is going to make life a lot easier in terms of how you deal with.
So there's a very other important point here that if we consider cloud infrastructure where you have multiple geos, and within those geos, each geo may have its own regulatory standards. So if you're moving assets from one geo to another, you need to be pretty sure that that asset that you've moved meets the regulatory compliance of that particular geo. So again, you know, unification gives us that ability to quickly and efficiently change the compliance standards that we have to adhere to.
That's a very, very good point. Yes. Because of the fact that, you know, when we talked about this earlier on, right? The life cycle of assets has changed, right? I mean, assets get created all the time, very, very quickly. And if you are a geographically or even, you know, multi-cloud dispersed organization, and you will inevitably have to follow different regulatory standards depending on where you deploy, what you've deployed, and, you know, how you what that type of asset it is. So that's a very good point. Thank you, Simon. Now, on top of that, upgrade planning is another aspect that's often overlooked. And in a lot of cases, when we start thinking about upgrade planning, I think most organizations think of this as a necessary evil that, you know, has to happen because you know, it potentially impacts performance or, you know, other things. But also think of it from the aspect of you have to be able to ensure that whatever software requires updates, is not going to break your environment. So the ability to know that is obviously very, very important. But it also needs to be part of your broader strategy in terms of making sure that none of this introduces any downtime, none of this introduces any additional performance problems, none of this introduces any potential security risks and exposure. So, you know, the entire patching cycle and upgrade planning, and I'll lump these two together for the moment. And you know, I know they are different, but both of these are incredibly important for the organization to ensure that you can know about these things before the problem occurs, right? Again, the entire concept of this last talking point for us here is to really ensure and drive the point how important it is to be prepared and to understand the environment with all its challenges and all its different architectures before a problem occurs, not when the problem's already there. It's fantastic to be able to troubleshoot your way out of a problem. We all do this, every organization does that. But it's incredibly important to get to a point where the vast majority is going to be dealt with way before it requires that troubleshooting to happen in the first place. And last, but by all means not least, configuration management. And it kind of really ties into the point we were just talking about in terms of upgrade planning, and a lot of the other points we've touched on earlier on. The ability to see where changes were made, for example, configuration drift, right? Whether that's due to automated patching processes that may or may not have patched wrongly, or whether that really is because of individuals or organizations, teams within the organization deploying containers or deploying VMs or deploying servers that do not follow a predefined configuration policy. Again, it goes back to the policy and the ability to be able to manage that across your entire estate. Configuration management is incredibly important to spot where things start to go out of compliance, because very often you do have certain compliance requirements, whether that's internal, right? So that's your own set of rules and requirements, or whether that's regulatory compliance. Very often you do have requirements to ensure that your configurations meet a certain standard, right? And I'm sure, Simon, I'm sure I forgot something. So let's see if I have.
You were spot on. Configuration management is important. It gives you a view, essentially that you're not going to basically hit performance problems. You'll have a complete visibility of what's going on. You can set standards within the environment, a minimum standard, because you may have line of business applications that require a minimum standard. So being able to see that at a glance, again, it's a sort of a cascading chain of events if you don't manage that element as well.
Yep, absolutely. So the bullet point of this one really is be prepared and be proactive. That's the saving grace against having to deal with the firefighting all the time and potentially running the risk of having blind spots. It's really, being prepared and being proactive about that is really one of the last, of the three cornerstones that we talked about. With that, we're kind of getting towards the point where I think we want to start looking at questions. So first of all, let me thank you very much for taking the time. I still see we've got the vast majority of people in the call. That's fantastic. I clearly managed with Simon that we didn't bore you all to death. That's a fantastic start. So let's see what the questions are, and let me also have a look at the poll, because I'm quite interested to see what the poll outcome is. Okay, yes, and unfortunately or fortunately, whatever way you want to look at, I can share the numbers for a second. So the responses were in order of percentage. No hybrid or multi-cloud strategy, 38%. I don't know, 31%, which is, by the way, perfectly fine answer. We have only hybrid cloud strategy, 23%, and then the remaining 8% is we have both. And it really brings home the idea of what we talked about earlier on. And I'm aware that that statement was very brash, that like, no matter whether you think you have a strategy, you don't. And it really goes back to the point of the three main challenges or main pillars that we talked about are really the ones that every organization needs to take to heart and start thinking about how to implement these as a hybrid or multi-cloud strategy, so that you can really get ahead of this instead of ending up being in the firefighting mode that most organizations are in. So thank you for everyone who actually participated. Really, really appreciate it. So let's have a look at whether we have any questions. There was no Q&A raised here. No questions. That's almost the first for me. Please, if you do have a question, put it either in normal chat or put it into the Q&A bit, and Simon and I will be happy to pick it up from there. I'm going to leave it open for another 2 minutes or so and see, because I know everyone is incredibly busy, so I don't want to hold you for longer than we need to, and just to give everyone a chance to have a quick look at whether we have questions or not.
And certainly, if people have questions after this call, please do reach out to us.
Absolutely.
We will answer those questions. Or if there's anything that you feel that we haven't covered that you would like us to cover on a one-to-one with you, we're more than happy to do that.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we can safely say we do not have any open questions. We're getting towards 1:45. So I think let me take the opportunity to thank everyone again. Really appreciated you taking the time. I hope there were some items in there that were of interest to you, and I hope you can really take home the point of just being prepared, knowing what's in the environment, and having a unified approach to those things will save your organization time and money in the long run. So with that, we have a question. What is best practice for vulnerability management? Thank you. It's an interesting question because it's one of those how long is a piece of string questions. I think one of the good ways to look at this is looking at generally known standards. Like you look at CISA, you look at governing bodies who regulate heavily regulated industries, right? So whether that's your governmental or things like healthcare and things like that. That's a very good starting point to start looking at what would potentially fit your organization in terms of vulnerability management, just from a regulations perspective, right? In terms of like what do you need to use for it? It really comes down to what's your infrastructure, right? What does it look like? If you run IoT devices, then obviously you're going to have different needs in terms of what you require than if you run general workloads, right? So Kubernetes and things like that. So definitely look for a way where a solution that you're looking at will be able to accommodate the things like CISA standards or other well-known standards, because at least with that you will have a very, very good basis on which you can build up, and you can continue adding policies and scanning facilities as you roll out. But my recommendation would be start out with something that's well-defined and fits your industry. I keep using CISA, but that's that's a good starting point. I hope that helped. Again, thank you very much, everyone, for taking your time. It was a pleasure. And as Simon mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I hope to see you in one of the next ones. Thank you very much.